Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have today Qui Lin, a scholar that decided to join us for this episode. She defended her dissertation and obtained her PhD from Duke University, and will soon start her postdoctoral appointment at Cornell in the fall. She has two main research projects, one focused on the 18th century history and philosophy of science, and the other in Chinese philosophy. It's my great pleasure to have you here today, John, because you are a young, brilliant scholar. You just wrote the Aristotle Prize also. With a fascinating paper, if you want to tell us more about it. So yeah, I'm very happy to have you here and to know what you think about happiness, the meaning of life, if any of your work somehow and research you're conducting at the moment touches on these topics. So the floor is yours. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Susie, for inviting me. I was very pleased and a little bit honored too that you learn about me and my research from website. And otherwise, we wouldn't have known. I thought, wow, this is really my scholarship. Really take me to meet people and to go out into the bigger world. So, thank you so much for sending out this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. So right now, I just defended my dissertation and completed my PhD degree at Duke. And I am now working on two projects. So one is on Émilie du Châtelet. She is a woman philosopher who's gaining increasing attentions in the scholarship in recent years. And the other is in Chinese Islamic philosophy, which is a subfield that many Chinese philosophers didn't even know that exist. Because when we talk about Islamic philosophy, we don't identify that as a subfield within Chinese philosophy. So that is something that I'm very proud of starting doing. And I'm really, really interested in this philosopher called Wang Daiyu, who is the first Chinese Islamic philosopher and is the author of the first work in Chinese Islamic philosophy. So
what kind of wisdom can we get from this philosopher? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think what really get me into them is not just their theories or certain of their views on certain things, but really their life stories too. So both figures are really, inspiring figures. So they both have very rich life stories that would shed lights, on how they situate themselves with other philosophers at their period, for instance. So Émilie du Châtelet was a woman. And at the time in the 18th century Europe, not many women were allowed to do philosophy the way that we are, or even they don't have this sense of freedom when they are expressing their views in public. So Émilie du Châtelet really has to face a lot of criticisms undue and also challenges from the male dominant field in order to even get her voice out. So for instance, in order for her to publish her first piece, she has to go anonymously. So her foundational physics was first published anonymously. And then when she found out that people had a good reception of it, good enough reception of it, she decided that, I need to revise it and produce a better version of it. So that's when she published the second version, which was way stronger than the first one, and that one bore her real name, Émilie du Châtelet. So that's when I feel like, wow, this was a very different age to the one that I'm working in, but I can certainly share some of her perspectives, some of her struggles in getting her views out as a woman. So I thought, well, it's something that's very worthwhile to do. When I started my PhD, the first English translations of her Foundation of Physics just went out. And there was just a golden opportunity to jump on a new figure in a new book. So that was 5 years ago, actually, when my advisor then was still worried that, having a dissertation just on Émilie du Châtelet would be a little bit risky because she was such a minor figure at the time. So little has been written about her at the time. But I'm glad that I stuck to this choice. And yes, so I ended up having a dissertation where half of it was devoted to her.
And do you combine the interest in Du Châtelet and Islamic Chinese philosophy? If there is a combination, if there is a bridge, of course.
Yeah, so I was asked, many people ask me these questions. Is it a big picture of your research program such that it unifies all of these distinct fields together? I'm tend to say no. One of the things that might be a connection there is that Wang Daiyu, the Chinese Islamic figure, was writing his work in the 17th century. So there was a roughly the early modern period to the Western calendar. But that's the only thing that I really find that they have in common. So for me, how I started to do work in Chinese Islamic philosophy is very, is kind of peculiar. There was a time when the pandemic just hit and everything was shut down and students were asked to, return home and to do their work remotely. And so that was my fourth year when I'm starting to struggle with my dissertation on Du Châtelet. And I don't know about your experience, Susie, but I really find that it's very difficult to do philosophy lonely, just by yourself, without the immediate support of your advisor, your colleagues, the library, the campus. So at the time I was relocated to Atlanta to join my family here. And dissertating was a very difficult thing to do. So I had sleepless night. I even dream of writing my dissertation. That's when I realized that, I needed to take a break before my interest in her was ruined. I need to take a break. So that's when I turned to Chinese Islamic philosophy. It's just
why Chinese Islamic philosophy? What did it give you?
Yeah, so my husband just turns out to belong in the same ethnic group as the philosopher that I was working on. So I remember, having a dinner conversation with him one day, just about, do you people have, produced any important philosophy in the past? Because the Hui people has been, has settled in China for more than 1,000 years. So it's just a very natural, things to wonder whether any philosophers in the greater Chinese history is Hui. And he said he didn't think so. I don't know. I don't think so. But they just strike me as unlikely, right? They've been here for so many years, and they have been very much encultured or a part of the Chinese people, but they still retain some distinctive characteristics as the Hui. So I went back to Google, and that's what happened. I was just immediately amazed by how much was there that was not receiving much attention, especially in the Anglophone scholarship. I mean, there were some very good work produced on Wang Daiyu in the religious study, but not much in philosophy. So that's why I decided that I need to know more, because this is just fascinating.
And that led you to writing the paper that won the Aristotle Prize, right?
Yes.
What was the main message, the main, wisdom that you managed to gather from the experience of writing that paper, from studying that material?
Yeah, so I think it was very different than anything that I have written before. It was certainly not something that involves a lot of history and philosophy of science, for instance. But I was able to see that in past scholarship on Wang Daiyu, people tended not to see him as distinct and original. So there was something that I struggled a lot with Du Châtelet too. So people don't tend to see her as a distinct and original philosopher. They tended to label her as, a follower of some male philosophers. So for instance, people call her Leibnizian, a Wolffian, a Newtonian, right? So there was some struggle that I do see in common in my writing of Du Châtelet and Wang Daiyu, that it is so hard for them to be identified as someone who really has their own voice. So I think as a historian of philosophers, maybe a job of me to do is to recover them, is
Right.
to give them their due place in the history. So something that really kept me working is that if someone like Wang Daiyu decides to write philosophy, to express his views on so many different philosophical topics, he's got to feel that, you know, whatever that was existing in his world was not enough, right? He's got to feel that I need to say something myself. I need to say something different than whatever that I am being exposed to, right? Otherwise, why would he bother to even write such a book, you know, about God, about ethics, about, you know, even about some epistemology? So why would he bother if he didn't have anything interesting to say? So that's also something that kept me working in a lot of.
Of course.
Yes, I just believe that they must have something interesting and original.
What was the most original and interesting thing you got from his writing?
Oh, you mean Wang Daiyu's? Yeah, so in my paper, for instance, Wang Daiyu was using this Neo-Confucian terminology, like the non-ultimate and the great ultimate, to articulate his theories of creations. So in the past treatment of the ultimate in Wang Daiyu, scholars didn't tend to find that as original move on his part. They thought, oh, he was incorporating some important concept from Neo-Confucianism to articulate his theory of creation. However, if we really look into what those terminologies stand for, we find that his conception was really, really different from any Neo-Confucians, because while, of course, he was committed to the very different metaphysical picture of how things come about, right? So for instance, the non-ultimate in him, in Wang Daiyu, the non-ultimate stand for the Muhammadan spirit. So that was the second thing that God creates, and through this Muhammadan spirits, God creates the rest of the world, the rest of creation. But in Neo-Confucians, because they don't have God, they don't have Muhammadan spirit, they use the same concept, but they express a very different idea. So in this alone, I think it's enough to build a paper around it. And that's what I did in the Aristotle paper.
Does this view change the way in which you feel in the world? I mean, you mentioned that you wrote this paper during the pandemic in a specific time in your life in which you needed to regain some distance from your dissertation. This worldview, this religious worldview, give you some kind of serenity in your personal life, or is an intellectual exercise only? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think it's both. So when I first got started, I was just really needed to take a mental break from my dissertation. I hope my advisor didn't see this part. But as the more I get into it, I started to feel like, it might be a little bit odd to say, but I do feel like I'm responsible for writing this, right? That he deserves to be known as a more important figure than he has been so far. So that was something that was driving me at the time of composing this paper. But of course, because this is not the major field, this project lies completely outside my dissertation project. So I don't have as much pressure of getting it completed and submitted to journals, for instance. Like, I don't have the same sense of urgency. This was more driven by my interest in him first, and then also this sense of responsibility that he needs to be known at least to more philosophers.
So it seems so that in you it's very strong what you were telling me before, through the questionnaire. I mean that your mother's job influenced your way of doing philosophy quite a bit, because your mom is a reporter, as you told me, and there's very much in you the desire to give justice to stories that are untold, to people that are not properly known, and to give voice to thoughts that otherwise would remain hidden. Is this a component of your work?
Having to think very carefully about your questionnaires just make me realize how deeply my mom as a reporter has influenced me. So although she's a reporter, she's not a reporter in the traditional sense. So she wrote about past stories. So she will write about a lot of stories that happened in the 30s, in the 20s, in the 50s, where people who were otherwise forgotten in the history were recovered because of her writing. And because she really cares about the people that she wrote about, she was able to build a lot of personal connections with them too. So I guess I'm always very fascinated by the aspect of her work, where she didn't just do something to make a living, right? So, but also she was able to change so many people's lives and to make friends, build connections with them, and to view herself as a part of a bigger world. I guess that was something that has always fascinated me, but I didn't realize that it was something that I am seeking in my own work until you asked me to reflect on how you get started on this. So I didn't
right.
Yeah.
It seems you're doing it. You know, as a professor, I often get the question, why aren't women in our textbooks, in our philosophy textbooks? Probably women are not good for philosophy. And no, wait. Actually, there has been, we had the women, but unfortunately, history wasn't that kind toward them. So I'm really happy that you're spending time to revive, for example, du Châtelet, who has a very unique take on philosophy, but it's very, very little known and hardly mentioned in textbooks.
I think that in 20 years, this will change. You will no longer have students asking you, why aren't women in our early modern textbook, at least? Because really early modern woman philosopher is one of the fastest moving fields nowadays in early modern philosophy. So maybe not even in 20 years, maybe in 10 years, we'll see the substantial change in how we tell the history of early modern philosophy. So
I hope so. Thank you. Yes, I hope so. And look, does this job of unveiling stories, giving voice to thoughts that have influenced our present but have not been articulated aloud, does this bring you happiness, or do you think that happiness is something else? Is there a connection between, fulfilling your vocation in philosophy and feeling happy, or this vocation brings you more worries than anything else?
More happiness than worries. I think the more you engage in this,
I'm glad.
the more that you are surprised by how much difference you're making. Because as I mentioned before, I've always felt that philosophy is a very lonely undertaking. You are kind of stuck in your head and you have yourselves to talk to. And it's sometimes really difficult for you to see your own work objectively, because you're in it, you're in it by yourself for too long. But that was my own thinking. So I thought, philosopher is just working by herself on the armchair and is always leading a very lonely life in her head. But the more that I find that my work is gaining interest outside, when I go to conferences, when I have conversations with people like you, I realize that I'm not lonely in this undertaking at all, right? No matter how narrow and how peculiar or how wacky sometimes I think my interests are, there are always people who share with me those interests. I always have audience. There always another person out there who thinks that what I do is valuable and even important. And so, yeah, so in a way, I don't know how common this experience is for philosophers. Philosophy really brings me out, bring the inner self of me out to meet more people, to realize that there are more connections in the world than I would otherwise be able to establish
It's
with
peculiar,
others.
yeah?
It's the coolest things ever. It really gets me to see a bigger world and to meet more people. I think that's the happy things for me.
Yeah, because it's a soul contact. It's really, yeah, it was surprising for me too to see how you actually are the citizen of the world, the true citizen of the world, because you can come in contact with people that are on the other side of the globe. But for some reason they have your same curiosity about a very specific topic. And if you are open enough, yeah, okay, it sparkles an interesting conversation that allows you to rethink your topic. I mean, like for us, we met because I read your article. And I said, oh, wow, that's really an original piece of philosophy. I want to know this scholar better. I want to be able to know what she's up to. Yeah. And yeah, so philosophy can bring some kind of happiness in terms of becoming yourself, having a chance to become yourself in a way that is introverted and extroverted at the same time, it seems.
I'm also always surprised by how friendly people are, like as philosophers too. So people might have some negative stereotype about philosophers, like they are not the nicest people, but that's just contrary to my impressions. I feel like I'm always just one email away from anyone that I would like to talk to, right? That I like to share my idea with, and even some very leading scholars in certain fields. Once we find that we have some converging interests, we can very easily spend 2 hours talking about just one thing. Where else do you have this kind of accessibility? I don't know. I haven't found it elsewhere. I only find it in philosophy. So,
and yeah. Is it? I know that you are transitioning somehow from your place of origin and to the US, to the East Coast. Is it? Do you find any difference? Do you think that the United States is more friendly, more approachable in that sense, or did you find that it's true everywhere, that you are an email away from people to approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't really been a part of the Sinophone scholarship, so I didn't really know many scholars in China. I came to the States too early. Like I started my college here, so all of my my friend network, most of it, except for my high school friends, were in the U.S. So yeah, but I also wondered about that, if that's part of the American culture, that where people were generally more approachable. But maybe not.
Maybe not. Who knows?
I don't think so. I tend to think that it's about philosophy, really, because I have connections with scholars in Europe too.
Right.
They strike me as, equally willing to start a conversation and pursue a topic together once we find a connection.
So, yeah. The love for the truth that keeps us together, and then what we can achieve is more important than any geographical or personal barriers. Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful. Thanks for bringing that up. And was there a moment in which you didn't feel safe, secure, where you saw your chance to feel happy endangered, and how did you react to that, if that happened?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when I first started to work on Du Châtelet, she was still a very minor figure at the time. Like the first English translation, the complete English translation of her just came out. And there, so I was at a conference. Yes, I was at a conference in Notre Dame that year when they were celebrating the completion of this translation, where several senior philosophers, when I told them that I'm very interested in building my career around the Châtelet, I was receiving certain advice not to focus on what I wanted to focus on, because she really took a lot of things in her philosophy from another male figure, Christian Wolff. Right, so that was an advice that I received from at least two senior philosophers. And that was a little disheartening, but I also knew that they were doing this because they care for me.
Right.
They didn't do this because they didn't want me to do something interesting. They were out of goodwill, like just advised me not to invest too much in a figure who was secondary. Yeah, that really gave me it was very disheartening to hear this from them. But I also, while in the meantime, realizing that they were doing this because they care for you. They didn't want you to go down a garden path, to waste your time on something that may not turn out to be really important, worthwhile. So that was hard. It was,
I can imagine.
Yeah, but I think it also was a great opportunity for me to confront this kind of worries or admonition early, because that's when I realized that if Du Châtelet turns out to be the secondary figure, we need serious scholarship to prove that. We need to write paper to prove that she was taking things from Wolff. We cannot just rely on our impressions. That, there's some very similar passages in Du Châtelet and Wolff, and she's later than him, so she must be the secondary and he must be the original, right? I don't think that's how we should do scholarship. If my dissertations turn out to be the proof of Du Châtelet's lack of originality, so be it. I'm gonna do that line by line. I wanted to see exactly where she was taking things from him. Right? So that's when I decided, well, instead of, being disheartened and being disappointed and being, insecure about whether you picked the right figure, you should confront the question itself instead, right? If she's secondary, then prove it. That can be your job too. That can be the dissertation too, right? But I'm glad that it turns out that she doesn't take everything from Wolff, especially, at least with respect to the problem of space. That's something that it was very clear now, but it wasn't clear then to me. I'm just glad that, this is the moment, this kind of challenge really helped me to realize what is doing scholarship, what doing scholarship amounts to. If we do we want to rely on our impressions and be scared away because we hear things? Or do we want to take that as something, as a hypothesis to be tested? I think I chose the latter, and I'm glad that I did.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Thank you for taking this more difficult path, but I think also more rewarding. Certainly for the scientific community, and I hope for yourself too. What's the most original aspect you think we miss of Du Châtelet? What's the message that that she conveyed to us? What do you think?
Yeah, so at first, my work was just to compare her and Wolff. So it would just become, just comparing them where she diverged from him. But there was a certain point where I realized that, well, if we set up Wolff as her only point of reference, that may not be the most helpful way of bringing out, the original, the interesting aspect of her. So I started to think about her more, in the background of this debate between the relationists and absolutists about the nature of space. So on the one hand, there are relationists like Leibniz and Wolff who thinks that space is just relations among objects. It's nothing real in itself. It's just the relations. But there's also, on the other hand, the absolutist who thinks that space is absolute in the sense that it exists independently of the objects. Right? It's not just the objects' relations. So what Du Châtelet come out as really distinctive in this debate is that on the one hand, she agrees with the Leibnizian that, well, metaphysically, space just is the relations among objects. But on the other hand, this is where she becomes really, interesting. I think she thinks that the Newtonian idea of absolute space is really attractive because the mind, when we represent space to ourselves, it does appears to us that space is independently of the objects that exist in space. So she was more interested in how we represent space, such that we tend to attribute certain features to space, such as space is empty, space is independent of the objects that exist in space, and that space is homogeneous, right? So, yeah, so I think these contributions to this debate was not made by anyone before her, and it really should have a due place in the whole history about this debate.
I totally agree with you, and it's very modern.
Yeah,
it's then I'm thinking of Kant and what he adds to the discussion, and I mean she was already there, and wow, yeah. It's important to give voice to. Do you think that there's something she said that might be useful for the way in which we conceive space even today? I mean, that can bring something new to, the consideration of space-time in which we define space today. Or is it in any case obsolete because now physics is in another place?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with the modern physics of the 20th century.
Yeah, of course, we're going.
Yeah, so I really cannot speak to that. But I do think that what she pointed out was something very fascinating. That is, when we know better how our minds represent something to ourselves, we would be in a better position to see why we tend to believe something about space, for instance, about time. She also talks about time. Right? And there's oftentimes a mismatch between how things are in themselves and how we cognize them, how we represent them, what we believe about them. And what we need to do as philosophers is to trace the origins and formation of our ideas. How do we even begin to believe that space is independent of the objects, right? Just to look deeper into the mind and see how the mental process contributes to the beliefs that we form. So I think that was one of the most interesting aspects of her project in the chapter of space and time.
That's really, really interesting. And do you think that now I make a little jump here because space seems something objective, or at least tangible. I don't know, although it's really not, it's very complicated. But do you think that emotions, feelings have their own space? Do you think that there's a dichotomy here too, the way in which they appear in themselves, the way in which they are in, I mean, how does happiness appear to you? How does it look like? Is there an objective way to describe it in which in itself happiness is this, or it's always something related?
I haven't thought about that questions before. What do you think? Are emotions in space, or?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking while you were talking, because this interview is around happiness, meaning in life, and so on. I mean, here maybe I become a little Aristotelian, but it seems that environment has its responsibility on the way in which we perceive emotions, we live emotions. And it seems also that society creates a space of emotions. Don't you think? I mean, they tell us happiness should look like this. And you have a super healthy, often woman, cute, that smiles and has, I don't know, money and whatever. You say, yeah, okay, so I will not be happy. I'm not interested in happiness or something like that. I had many interesting discussions with my students in which they say, okay, why do you bother about happiness? It's why is America, are the USA so fixated on the pursuit of happiness? It seems like a job. And I wonder if space has anything to do with that, just to bring homage to Du Châtelet and see if we can think of emotions in space. I don't know, what's your take on it? This is the route where my mind would go.
Yeah, I mean, as a Chinese, I do relate to what your student says about, why Americans were so fixated.
She's a Chinese student.
Because I remember that when I first came to the US, I feel like even when you're saying hello, you're saying the same words to another person approaching you, you said it very differently, right? They would say, hello. You just respond, hello. You think that you're a little bit out of place there, right? So that you don't really kind of occupy the same, I don't know, field or space with the person, saying hello in a very enthusiastic way to you. So I began to change. I began to, culture myself to be the happier person, at least in the period. I feel like, oh, I need to be more active. I need to, add more body language when I say hello, and and that's when I started to feel more natural, as a more natural part of the same space with the persons that I'm approaching.
To meet the energy.
Yes, so 5 years ago, my mom visited me when I graduated from my master school, Tufts. And that was the first time there was a second time actually, that she saw me interacting with Americans while with her. She was like, you're very different persons when you speak English and when you are interacting with people around you than you are in China when you are speaking Chinese and interacting with people there. I didn't even realize how radical the change was until she brought it up, that she was supposed to be the person who knows me the best, right? We video chat very often, at least sometimes once a day. It's a little embarrassing to admit, but so we see each other every day. It's not as if she hasn't seen me for a long time and she came to this judgment, but that she has seen me in a different setting, in a different space than the one that was just the two of us, or the one where we're both in China, right? So she was like, you didn't look like my daughter when you speak English. It was that radical that I'm a completely different person when I'm interacting with Americans or, people around me.
Seems that emotions have their own space. Do you think that you have an idea of, and also an attraction toward happiness in the Chinese part of you, and another kind of attraction, interest, idea of happiness in your American side of yourself? What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about that. So that's another hard question that I find really difficult to answer in your questionnaire. So to me, I think happiness is just a state where you don't feel there's anything in particular that's missing from your life, that you're very content. So for me, I usually just, equate these two ideas, the idea of happiness and the idea of contentment. And I think, I'm not sure how universal this idea is among the Chinese. For me, to think about what happiness is in abstract terms is very difficult. The only thing that I was thinking was just this idea of Americans like to fixate on the idea of being happy. Like, you need to be happy. That was end goal. That was a very different thing, a very foreign thing for me to to feel sympathetic with. But in the meantime, because I'm a part of this society, I can also see myself making moves to be the part of the society of by looking more happy, by looking happier, or I don't know. Yes, you know what I'm.
Absolutely. And while you are talking, I wonder if now that we are going on to this way, if this has some kind of influence on the level of depression. I mean, we have, especially young adults, we have to look so happy, so
Healthy.
energetic, yeah, healthy, and so on, that you cannot afford to have a day off, a day down. You would look rude, which, you know, there might be a midway between having to be happy and being rude. You may just be neutral, and that's all. I wonder if happiness can be a burden sometimes.
I think so. I think especially during the pandemic, where people were feeling different levels of stress and different kinds of stress. But sometimes, as you know, someone who's, for instance, a middle class student, you know, students from middle class family, who's cut off from her schools and friends, who was, you know, forced to study by herself, and doing all this kind of daily activities. You might feel as if you didn't even have, even though you feel a lot of stress from schoolwork and your social life, you were not in the best positions to express that, because people will say, well, you're already very well off. Look at those people. Like, people were losing job and people who are getting sick. And there are people who are more entitled to express stress and negative emotions than you do. You will feel like if you are posting things on your social media about how stressful you were in the process, you will receive more negative response from your audience than others, because they don't think that you deserve to be to express this kind of views, because you're already very well off, so much better off than other people. So I do feel that this is something that some of my students will review to me once we got into some conversations about, you know, what bothered them lately. They would say, well, I was just really feeling down, but I don't think that people could, but when I express it, people don't tend to recognize that as something negative. They will in turn educate me about how lucky I am being a Duke student. In this whole situation, I'm the luckiest. So they don't know what to do with this situation.
And this takes a space to be. I mean, our main job as human beings is just being, I think. And life is highly relational. I mean, in order to be, as you were saying about the pandemic time, it took away the possibility for you to be in contact with others. And yeah, wow, if happiness takes space from us to be, I mean, if happiness becomes an actual impediment from us to be ourselves,
Yes.
then we are better off without it. I mean, then we have really to be careful to give to happiness a meaning that is real, because I can have a day off, and that's enough, and I just say it, and yeah, it does. A person can just acknowledge it without demanding anything more. And there's no responsibility, there's no demands. But we need to make space. We need to make space for people to be. And sometimes the imperative of happiness takes this space away from us. It would be fun to see if it's the American mindset, to check if it's the American mindset or I'm Italian, so I can't say either. I noticed that too, actually, that yeah, but I moved to California in the Bay Area, and it's very up. uptone. It's
Yeah.
I was surprised about that too. I liked it. I mean, it's friendly, it's warm, but I was surprised as well. So that's a very interesting point to reflect
Yeah,
on.
actually, something related to that is that a lot of parents, I mean, at least my parents would tell me,
Right.
all we want is for you to be happy. We don't
Yeah.
want you to make money. We don't want you to,
Yeah.
get a
Yeah.
big,
Yeah.
big name out there. We just want you to be happy.
Hmm.
But sometimes these two can give your children a lot of pressure because when they
Right.
feel sad, when they feel depressed, they
Right.
don't feel as open to you anymore. They feel like they owe you to be happy.
Hmm.
Right? So when they are, so I mean, I say they, but really just my personal experience. So when I feel down and when I feel,
Hmm.
lacking in motivation,
Hmm.
or even the sense of meaning, which happened, I don't feel that I would try to keep that from my mother.
Oh,
You're supposed
yeah.
to be the one that, that we're the closest on the one hand, but on the other hand, when I feel vulnerable, I chose not to
Hmm.
reveal this part to her because she always said, I just want you to be happy. So
Right.
this is
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
yeah, I realize that this can also become a burden
Mhm.
on the children too, when they feel like, well, if they are not being happy, they are not meeting your expectation, they are not they're not leaving the best part of themselves, so maybe they should keep that part from you. And I'm not sure if that's the best way to maintain a healthy relationship between parents and children who are already living so distant apart, like me and my mother. Uh,
Right.
so I'm beginning to rethink about this practice of hiding this dress from my mom. Maybe she wasn't necessarily meaning that I only wanted to hear about your happiness. I don't want to hear about your unhappiness.
Absolutely.
That
Yeah.
couldn't be her intention.
Uh-huh.
But when she said that, me,
Right.
yeah, um,
It
so,
becomes a strange imperative. And certainly your mom loves you and
mhm,
uh, wants your well,
mhm.
your well-being more than your happiness. Who knows? But yeah, that's a very interesting point that you are bringing up to the conversation. Yeah, with my studying, I come to think that our main job is really just to be. Nothing more, nothing less.
Mhm.
Then all the adjectives we put around this being become a little tricky. And
Mhm.
certainly happiness, as it seems from this conversation, is one of those values that it's not necessarily a value. It can become very easily a disvalue, and even yeah, reason for distance, for sadness, depression, for uncomprehension between yeah, members of the family that love each other, or
So deeply, yeah.
friends. What do we do? what, what's our resolution? Let's
Yeah.
find a positive way
Mhm.
to cope with it. In conclusion, what do you think?
I think there's a part in the Chinese culture where people tend to just share good news and not the bad news. So in
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, we say we only like 报喜不报忧, that you just report the good things and not the bad things.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe that culture can use a little change there. If we're really, because families really are the closest, like you
Yeah.
maintain the closest, the strongest bond with them. So no matter when you are, so when you are vulnerable, those will be the people who are most likely to lend you support, right? So if you don't tell them bad news, how you didn't, you just
Yeah.
decline them the opportunity, the access to help you to begin
Mm-hmm.
with.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so this also helped me realize that maybe I need to talk to my mom.
Right. To start from there.
Yes,
Ah,
we can start from there. That well, we can. It's okay to strive for happiness, but we also need to acknowledge that you can't always be happy all the time.
yeah. Yeah.
There are parts of life where just sadness would dominate, and we, as families, we grieve together, and we lend each other support. That's more important.
I love it. Let's do it. Yes. This direction. So look at my last question here, which I ask everyone, and I love it because it always gets different answers, and it's a huge question. So let's see. What do you think the meaning of life is?
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God.
That's the question that gives the name to this podcast. I mean, all considering at the light of this conversation, of your readings, of your life, does life have a meaning? If so, which one? What do you think?
Yeah, it's so funny because when people learn that, I'm not sure if you have this experience that, so when people learn that I'm a philosopher, I study philosophy, they will ask me, well, so you're an expert in the meaning of life. You must spend so much time thinking about the meaning of life. It's a very common misconception about what philosophers do and what they spend their time doing.
Yeah.
But then I always just disappointed them by telling them, oh, that's just not my main business. It's not even a part of my...
Rarely write about that. Of course, we want to avoid to say anything about that because it's such a huge question that you don't want to compromise your writing into that. But then again,
unavoidable.
Yeah, we are somewhat those who think about big questions without giving final answers. Rarely ever we gave final answer. But I mean, today, if I ask you in this moment, what's the meaning of life? What would you say? If it has a meaning for you, because I had also many guest speakers who said, the meaning, there's no meaning, there's what I have here today.
Yes, and I think there's something, I would resist saying that. I wouldn't, I don't feel as comfortable saying that I don't think there's a meaning to life. On the other hand, maybe there's something behind the resistance. We can think about it more, but on the other hand, I just don't know what else can be said about the meaning of life. Right now, at this moment, I would say just something that I would never consider killing. I wouldn't consider killing myself and of ending this life was probably because there was so much in life that is about this like rewarding connections that you made with people that make you feel that you are not alone here. So to me, the sense of like not being alone in this world is enough for this life to be meaningful. Yeah, it sounds odd, but yeah. But you want me to say this, so I will.
I had also guest speakers who didn't reply, and then they wrote an article on it.
Oh, okay.
Days later, months later, and they sent it to me. So if it happens for you to find more in your answer, just let me know, and I will be happy to.
Okay. I do want to think more about emotions because that's something that I didn't think as carefully about before. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was really an interesting path we went through together. I mean, we look at happiness in a very critical but fruitful way, I think. And also the answer you gave about the meaning of life is, I think, beautiful and helpful. I mean, we tend to forget how important it is to have connection, to have a network, to have people who get us. It's an important reminder to cultivate in life a network of people that make each day somewhat rewarding because of the exchange you can have in that moment. So thank you so much for this pearl of wisdom, and thanks for joining this episode today. I was really, really happy to get to know you.
Same here. It's so much fun. Thank you so much, Susie, for making this possible.